Joining us now is the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda. Mr. President, it's great to see you today in Washington. Thank you for coming to talk to us on Bloomberg. You've had a big day here in the nation's capital, meeting with Speaker Mike Johnson and with President Biden. You just arrived from the White House. These two men are far apart, it seems, on the issue of funding Ukraine. Are you more concerned now, following these meetings, than you were about American funding for Ukraine?
Good afternoon. Let me start by saying that, indeed, this is a very important day for us, for Poland. This is the 25th anniversary of Poland's accession to NATO in 1999, a big event for the whole of our nation, as I said today. It is fair to say for a couple of generations of Poles after the Second World War. That meant a real fall of the Iron Curtain. It meant our full entry to the political community of the West. We have always stressed that culturally we have always been part of the West, but thanks to that, thanks to the support of the United States, which we always stress very strongly. Also thanks to the determination of the Polish Americans who gave their strong support to their homeland over the ocean. Poland has been part of NATO for 25 years now, and today, indeed, this has been a very important day to me. Mr. President Joe Biden invited myself and Prime Minister Tusk and the Polish delegation to the White House on the occasion of the 25th anniversary, and we had a very important meeting. But before that, I was invited to the Congress, where I met with representatives of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and indeed we had a conversation about important matters connected with security today. We talked about the security after 25 years of our membership in NATO, but also we talked about security through the lens of Russian aggression in Ukraine. This is a leading topic today. Today I raise these subjects as a neighbor to Ukraine, as the country who is close by. I am the one who is able to follow the developments there firsthand, and that is the picture I gave today, both to senators as well as to the members of the House. I described in details how we see the situation and what Ukraine needs today to make sure that Putin does not win the war, because this is the most important thing to us. Putin, Russia, must not win this war, and we are taking full responsibility for our words. This results from our experience, also from our history. We are the nation who was enslaved by Russia several times. If Russia wins the war in Ukraine, if Putin wins the war in Ukraine, he will attack one more time. He will attack other states, because this is Russian imperialism reborn, and it is greedy. It will be willing to attack further. That is why it has to be stopped. It has to be blocked, and it has to be punished. And this is the most important task that is facing the community of the West today, and this community is led by the United States of America.
So, Mr. President, essentially was your message that if the U.S. Congress fails to provide additional support to Ukraine, not only could they be harming Ukraine's war effort, but potentially harming Ukraine's neighbors, such as Poland?
Powtarzam jeszcze raz.
Let me repeat once again. It is necessary to make sure that Russia, that Putin, does not win this war. He has to be stopped. And the only way that we can see today to do that, without getting involved directly in the war, without the need to send soldiers to fight, is support with equipment, with state-of-the-art possible armaments given to Ukraine, financial support to Ukraine. And that is today I really made an appeal to look at that, because that is the only precondition today. And I said very clearly, both to the Speaker of the Senate and to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, also to the leaders of the minorities attending the meetings. I told them today Putin can be stopped at a cheap price, because only by providing equipment and money, if one has to send troops against Russia, because if Russia keeps attacking, because Russia might want to expand its empire further on, then this price will be very high indeed. So today, one can stop Russia at a cheap price by sending military equipment, by sending money, and by supporting Ukraine, who is defending herself today. In this way, one can stop imperialism and provide peace in Europe and across the globe at a relatively low price. America has had its terrible experiences in this respect as well. I recalled the First World War, the Second World War, how many hundred thousands of American soldiers
soldiers, of young boys, fathers and sons perished, and their graves are there in Western European countries. The fact that Western Europe was free and was able to develop itself for so many decades, that was a big support from America. That support came when Europe was crashing under the burden of war. Then Americans drew lessons, drew conclusions from that. And then they started the Cold War. But the Cold War meant precisely not to fight. Nobody was dying. Money was spent. American soldiers were deployed, but not to fight, but to guard their security. Americans kept investing in weapons. They transferred weapons to Europe to make sure that there is strength so that Russia would not dare attack. And today, exactly the same thing has to be done. In order to stop the war, weapon has to be sent, money has to be spent, only money. We do not have to put people's lives at risk today. This is fundamentally important because there is no price tag on human life. So any financial amount pays off if compared to the situation where soldiers would have to be engaged in fight. And that is what I appealed, what I urged today to do, to help Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting today. We don't have to fight. They are defending their state, which was attacked. If we support them, they can resist. And they're waiting for our help, for the help of the West.
You believe you cannot win this effort. Ukraine cannot win this war without NATO. And you are proposing that NATO members increase their contributions to 3% of their gross domestic product. We're a long way from getting every member to pay 2%, Mr. President. How do you make that happen?
We will have to discuss it, and of course this is the first moment. You have to put that proposal on the table at a certain time. I recall 2 years ago, right after the Russian aggression against Ukraine started, literally 2 days after that, I made a proposal to the European leaders to send a letter to the President of the European Commission on opening a path of accession for Ukraine to the European Union, to grant the candidate status to Ukraine, to the European Union. And I called presidents of individual European member states. In terms of Central Europe, all the leaders of the Baltic states, neighbors of Poland, said, yes, there is no problem. Andrzej, we are going to sign this letter together to the European Commission. However, in the West, some leaders told me, what are you talking about, Andrzej? What are you saying? There is no chance for them to be admitted to the European Union. This is not the right stage. Just leave it. After 2-3 months, they were saying completely different things. Suddenly, everybody supported the gate to Europe to be opened for Ukraine, to grant the candidate status to Ukraine. And in June, after a few months, this status was granted to Ukraine. And today, I assume the same situation can happen. Somebody has to give this proposal, and that is what I'm doing. Because today, if you were speaking in the European Union, when we recently talked in Paris, and it was said that Ukraine has to be helped, that ammunitions have to be sent to Ukraine, most countries, majority countries, were saying we do not have even those production capabilities to get this ammunition produced quickly. We do not have enough background today to live up to all those commitments which we have adopted concerning a fast relocation of forces and so on and so forth. We need to strengthen the security of Europe. And I'm not only talking about buying combat military equipment, as we are doing today. Poland is spending more than 4% of GDP on defense. Today we are purchasing huge amounts of equipment from the United States. We're buying F-35s, HIMARS, launchers. We are purchasing Apache helicopters, state-of-the-art Abrams tanks. These are huge purchases, $50 billion. This is the estimated value of the contracts that we are implementing today. But the point is to make sure that also Europe starts to intensively produce, for instance, ammunition. And this requires investments to be done. So let us raise the defense spending to make sure that those investments can be implemented so that Europe can give itself a space of true security, and not just a security which is being talked about, but a real security where missiles are there in storages, where there is enough ammunition to defend Europe.
As you talk about raising defense spending, though, in this moment, it's worth pointing out that the very likely Republican nominee for president, former President Donald Trump, has suggested that NATO countries that aren't paying their fair share, Putin can do, and this is his words, whatever the hell he wants to them. If you make the bar higher
and Donald Trump potentially gets a second chance at the presidency, would you not be putting your fellow NATO allies more at risk potentially in this scenario? Or do you not believe the former president when he says that kind of thing?
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been the president of Poland for almost 9 years, since 2015. And I have already cooperated with 3 U.S. presidents. I started my cooperation with President Barack Obama. We made decisions at Warsaw NATO summit about enhanced forward presence of NATO in our part of Europe. That was a big success, which was later confirmed by the arrival of U.S. troops to Poland and their stationing in Poland. Today we have got 10,000 U.S. troops in Poland, and as Poland we are immensely grateful for that because it does increase our security remarkably. Then I cooperated with President Donald Trump for 4 years, and today, for almost 4 years, I have been cooperating with President Joe Biden, and this has always been a friendship because no matter who is in power in Poland or no matter who is in power in the United States, the foundation, the basis to us are good Polish-U.S. relations, and I'm glad that this is also understood in the United States of America. I had a good cooperation with President Donald Trump. I already communicated that in interviews. If we had an agreement about something with President Donald Trump, that agreement was always kept. I was pleased insofar as whenever we talked, I saw that he was able to understand the problems in our part of Europe, and I can say that with full responsibility. If you are asking me about that, we have always spent 2% of GDP on defense. We believe that we are a reliable ally. Today, we spend more than 4% of GDP on defense, and indeed, this huge change is seen in Poland, this huge strengthening of the Polish armed forces in every single aspect, actually. Having said that, I do understand those expectations that it is not only U.S. taxpayer who pays for the security of Europe, that European countries should also pay their fair share. I also come from general elections. I was also elected by my compatriots who have got very specific expectations, and if there is somebody saying, listen, I also have got my taxpayers, and those taxpayers are saying, just wait a moment, if we have an agreement that we are going to build a security, may they at least provide their own security themselves at a minimum. Why should we bear the full burden of for their security? This is understandable to me. If President Donald Trump today returned to this topic and he says 2%, responsible allies pay 2%, who does not pay 2%, they are not a responsible ally. I understand that. Europe already heard those words. When he was in power as President of the United States, he also spoke those words out loud at NATO summits, and he called on all NATO allies to keep their obligations, their commitments of 2%. But today, the situation has changed. Back then, we had a situation back from 2014. We had a situation where Russia, yes, it did occupy Crimea, but officially Russia did not officially say that it had attacked Donetsk or Lugansk. Back then, Putin was claiming there were separatists. And today, after 2022, after the 24th of February, we are witnessing a full-scale Russian aggression never seen by the world before, never seen since the Second World War at such a level, at such a huge scale. This is a total change of the conditions. And today, the 2% is not enough. This is my personal conviction. And this is the way I see it. And I've been the president of Poland, as I said, for 9 years. I have participated in NATO summits. I have participated in different meetings in the international arena, in maneuvers. I have been following the situation. I have visited Ukraine many times since the war began. I visited Ukraine one day before Putin attacked. On the 23rd of February, 2022, I was in Kiev together with the Lithuanian president, Gitanas Nausėda. We were the last presidents who shook the hand of Volodymyr Zelensky before the war, and he told us, I do not know whether we would see each other again. And so I know what I'm saying, because I visited Ukraine also after that. I visited the places where Russian troops had withdrawn, and they left burned down ground, ruined towns and houses. I know what war means, and I know how much you need and how much it is, how important it is to stop Russia, to stop the Russian terror.
Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Television and Radio. We appreciate your time, sir. That was the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda.